Okay, everyone. Well, I think we're going to start. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first in a series of discussions about anti-racism in Danforth East, hosted by the Danforth East Community Association. And my name is Alison McMurray, and I am the chair of DECA. And I would like to begin by saying that we acknowledge we are on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And we are now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with the multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Okay, and I would like to thank our hardworking volunteers at the Danforth East Community Association for planning tonight's discussion. Nicole, Rebecca, and Michelle, I couldn't have done it without you, so thank you very much for all your hard work. Further discussions in our series will be held at the last Monday of every month. So stay tuned, this is just the beginning. There will be more talks just like this. Watch your DECA blog and our DECA Facebook and Instagram pages for more information. We are recording tonight's session, so we're going to also put those up on our Facebook and socials tomorrow in case you've missed it, or in case you want to share this conversation with your friends or community members. I'd also like to thank our distinguished guest this evening. We have Cheryl Case with us, and we have Dr. Notisha Massaquoi, which probably after she told me how to say her name, Massaquoi, I don't think I said it correctly, so apologies. Oh my goodness. Thanks for sharing your experience tonight with our community. We very much appreciate you being here. And finally, a big thank you to Lanrick Bennett Jr. For bringing the discussion together and for graciously agreeing to be our host and moderator for tonight. So thank you very much for everything. And thank you everyone in the community for being here. Appreciate it. So I'm going to introduce, we have 4 politicians here with us tonight as well, and I'm going to introduce each of them individually, give them the floor for a couple of minutes, and then we're going to move on from there. So first up tonight, we're going to hear from Nathaniel Erskine-Smith, who is our Member of Parliament. So Nathaniel, take it away.
Great. Well, first I just want to thank DECA and all the volunteers for making this happen. I also want to thank the guests and Lanrick for putting it on. I especially like, so often in hosting events like this, it's politicians answering questions or doing a lot of the talking, and I really appreciated the idea in discussing this a bit earlier that it's about us listening, and I think that's really important because this is certainly at the federal level at least a serious part of the federal government's agenda where we saw, I would say, significant steps, although insufficient steps in the last 5 years, where we do now have an anti-racism national strategy. We do now have a secretariat that will hopefully be at the center, really be central to additional policymaking going forward. We've taken some steps in terms of a focus on Black communities and mental health, Black communities and employment. Certainly when we look at the reconciliation conversation and anti-Indigenous racism, we've seen significant steps forward as well, addressing some of the long-standing inequities in education and infrastructure. But obviously much more to be done. And on a personal note, in the when I think of the last 5 years, I think of whether it's been seconding a motion on Islamophobia, whether it has been introducing legislation on decriminalization, whether it is in this parliament pushing for addressing mandatory minimum sentences and sponsoring a bill out of the Senate to that effect. There are all sorts of different steps we can take in criminal justice, but the thing that I have been most struck by is when we look at the social determinants of health and we look at the impact, whether in health or in our criminal justice system, when we see the really disproportionate numbers and impacts on Black and Indigenous communities and people of color, the fact of the matter is so much of this conversation, from the reading I've done and the people I've spoken to, it ultimately comes down to economic justice and really addressing income inequality and really making sure we're giving everyone a sufficient equality of opportunity. And that means addressing poverty in a serious way. And that has been a large focus of my efforts, but it has to be a continued focus of the federal government. And otherwise, I just look forward to hearing the ideas and taking some of those ideas back to my caucus and back to Ottawa where I can.
Okay, well, thank you, Nate. I appreciate that. Next up, we have Rima Burns-McGowan, who is our member of Provincial Parliament. And thank you for joining. And we'll unmute you here. Sorry. There we go. There we go. There we go.
Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Allison, and thank you so much, DECA, for having me, and also for putting this important conversation on. As many of you know, but some may not, I come from South Africa. I was born, I come from a mixed background, and these issues are very near and dear to my heart. They're why my family left. They've dogged my personal life, and they are why I ended up as an elected official to make systemic change. It's been quite extraordinary to watch the revolution that has been sweeping the globe, actually, as people who have heretofore not paid attention to these issues are waking up to how important that they are. And conversations like this, change starts with a change in framework and a change in perspective and a change in conversation. So I'm really grateful to everybody who's here to have this conversation tonight. Thank you so very much from the bottom of my heart.
Great. Thank you, Rima. I appreciate it. And next we have our City Councillor, Mr. Brad Bradford. Let me just unmute you here. There we are. Oops. Okay. Trying. There we go. Okay.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Allison. And thanks to DECA for bringing us all together tonight. I'm Brad Bradford, City Councillor, for folks I haven't had a chance to meet. I will be brief. The most important thing for all of us here on the line to do tonight is to listen and hear from our guests. And I would like to thank Natisha, Cheryl, and Lanrick for sharing their time and their very important perspectives with all of us. We frankly need more discussions of this, and it's great that folks at DECA put up their hand and brought us all together as a community. These discussions do happen from time to time, but certainly not often enough. And there's been a number of issues as of late in our community where we've rallied around each other to have these discussions. But the fact that we're going to be doing this Monday nights on a monthly basis is just wonderful. I do want to acknowledge that obviously the genesis of much of the conversation that has been taking place over the past couple of months, you know, what we're seeing in the US, what certainly happens here in Toronto and in Canada as well. And the impact or the discussions around policing. You know, to be very clear, racism does exist in our city, in our institutions, in our agencies, and we do need to overhaul these structures that continue to perpetuate racial injustice in our communities. So, as many of you were very involved, and I heard from a lot of folks across Beaches East York and the City of Toronto about the council meeting on June 29th and the vote to defund police. You know, I certainly supported that, as you likely saw. I also supported the 20 recommendations that took really, you know, sort of practical, tangible steps to change the way we're delivering policing in the city. I think that's important, and in the correspondence that I have continued to have over the months since, folks have asked, you know, what's happening on that. This doesn't end with one council vote, and I think that was important to remember. One council vote was never going to address the injustice, the systemic racism that, you know, exists across our society. It just wasn't. So that work continues, and you know, without getting into much of the details, you know, the letter the mayor has already written to the province asking for the necessary changes that we would need to see to make those sort of changes in our budget, oversight, jurisdiction, and start implementing many of the recommendations that have been written about for years, but have failed to materialize and move forward. And I think that's why folks are so frustrated. And the last thing I want to touch on is, you know, it's important to be clear that the city is taking action and following up on what took place in council last month, but we also need to follow up here in the community. And you know, I think that there's a lot of folks are interested in understanding how they can be involved and what they can do to be a part of that change. It's not necessarily as high profile or big as council votes or you know, things that get discussed in parliament or legislature, but it is just as critical and arguably more important. So working with the community to find new ways to engage with vulnerable youth, connecting with faith-based organizations, working with nonprofits who are active in this space. I think equally important when things go wrong, when there are incidents of racism or violence, which, to be clear, have taken place in the past month here in our community, making sure that we are there, active and present, asking critical questions and pushing for justice. So assembling these type of conversations for learning engagement, super important. Again, it doesn't happen overnight, but it really does take a continual, dedicated and relentless commitment from all of us. And, again, I'd like to thank our panelists, Allison and the team at DECA, for making space for this discussion, and everyone who's on the line tonight to listen and learn. I'm very much looking forward to it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Brad. Appreciate that. And last but not least, we have our TDSB school trustee, Ms. Michelle Arts. We'll just get you unmuted here, Michelle. Are you okay to do that, Nicole? Okay. Sorry, guys. There we go. You're all set.
Getting alerts here. Thank you very much for having me tonight and for hosting this forum. It's really great to see this happening in the community. I will say, I will echo just to keep it brief. I will echo a lot of what our other local politicians have said. There's a lot of work to be done with respect to the school system. Equity and anti-racism, anti-oppression work, and in particular anti-Black racism work has been a priority for the board for a long time. But the TDSB is a really big system, and one of the things that we need to help move things forward at the school level, at the individual school level, is that community involvement piece. So we have anti-oppression and anti-racism embedded at the forefront of our leadership training. New hires, it's expected in our school improvement plans, which is the 3-pillar piece that schools work on during the year. But it needs to be embedded in the culture and the community of each school. Each of our schools looks very different. There's a different population in them. So the approach in each school needs to fit with that community. It needs to use the principles that we use within the TDSB for equity, but it also needs to involve the whole community. And I think in a lot of our schools, well, not necessarily a lot of our schools, but definitely in some of our schools, that piece is missing, that whole community piece. And so to have the conversation here today as a community piece that any parents in the audience can then go back to their schools and start the conversation. So this is a great conversation piece for school councils to have, rather than the so school councils have sort of fallen into a lot of the fundraising and the fun fairs and the socializing piece, which is nice for community, but they can also take on tougher conversations in the school. And as I said, it is anti-oppression and anti-racism equity work is embedded as one of the pillars of a school improvement plan. Every school has to have one. They need to work on it with staff and the school council, the principal. So it can be a really great community piece going forward. And Jennifer Story, trustee Jennifer Story and I, she's our trustee in the neighboring ward, started some of this work as a community piece. We started last month with addressing bias and giving parents and attendees a bit of homework around looking inward at inside yourself, inside your household, to start addressing those biases. And then we're going to bring it back in the fall as a school council piece as to how school councils can be actively involved in that anti-racism and equity piece in their own schools.
Okay, well, thank you, Michelle. So thank you to Nate, Rima, Brad, and Michelle for taking the time to be part of our discussion and for listening here tonight this evening. We want to really actively help to build a more inclusive community in Danforth East. So this, as we said earlier, is just the beginning. So without further ado, I want to get as much of the discussion in tonight as possible. And so I turn the night over to Mr. Landrick Bennett Jr., and please take it away.
Thank you, Allison. And everyone can hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name is Landrick Bennett. I'm going to be your moderator for the evening. A bit of just housekeeping as such. We are setting up right now the chat to turn that on so that if you have some questions, you can definitely put those in. This evening is for myself and our two guests to be able to have a discussion, and we're hoping that for the majority of that time you'll want to sit back and listen. I want to thank DECA for providing the space for us to have an open and frank discussion. I want to thank my two speakers for taking the time to converse with me on I think a very important topic within our community. And I want to thank all of you, the audience, for being here tonight. The message and the tone of this discussion is, it's going to be a bit dicey. It could be a bit uncomfortable. I can't promise that it's going to not make you jerk a bit, and that's okay. It's been a long time for me to see or to have 3 Black people speaking, and I hope it's not the last time. George Floyd died on May 25th, 2020. It took a total of 8 minutes and 46 seconds to end his existence. 6 days after his death, I selfishly turned off all of my notifications from my phone to Facebook, all my social media, every conceivable way that that people could get a hold of me. I couldn't function. I didn't care to talk about how I was feeling. I didn't care to give advice. Friends wanted to know what they needed to do, what was the next step. And I couldn't be that person. Will Smith said it best, racism is not getting worse, it's getting filmed. And we are seeing a lot of what has basically been a continuous nightmare for generations, for decades, for centuries. It's been a long time. So before I introduce our two panelists, I want to kind of say that I was going to open up the evening asking the question, Black Lives Matter, as a touch point maybe, and as a way to start off the evening. And thankfully I was respectfully told, no, you can't start it that way. You can't do that. Anti-Black racism lives and breathes here in Canada. It is in Ontario, it is in Toronto, and it's right here across the streets of Danforth East. And on a level from 0 to 10, is it a 6? Maybe a 4? Could it be a 10? Can't be a 0 or 1. Black lives in our East End community, our city, our province, and our country, it really does matter. Our guest tonight, Cheryl Case. She practices as a human rights approach to community planning. As a founder and principal urban planner of CP Planning, Cheryl coordinates with charities, private sector industries, and communities to resource the systems necessary to secure dignified living for all people. This includes an acute focus on housing as a human right, supporting urban agriculture, and improving the ability for marginalized residents to access arts and culture. Hello, Cheryl.
Hello, Anna.
We also have Dr. Nutisha Mazakwa. I said that right.
No, you're good. You're good.
I'm good. Now, Nutisha is a subject matter expert in the area of equity, anti-oppression, anti-Black racism, and race-based data collection. She has consulted globally for UNAIDS, WHO, and the United Nations Social Development Council on the subject of racism and its impact on health outcomes. Most notably, she spearheaded the development, led the Women's Health in Women's Hands Community Health Center in Toronto for 21 years before retiring from that role. It remains the only community health center in North America which provides specialized primary care for Black and racialized women. Nutisha serves as a board of trustees for the Center for Addiction and Mental Health and the Canadian Founders for AIDS Research. As a part of our part to address the impact of COVID-19, Nutisha serves on the Ontario Health System's Personal Protective Equipment, PPE, and implementation work group to ensure equitable distribution of PPE across the province. Hello, Nutisha.
Hi, Lanrick.
Just a few numbers right off the bat. Visible minorities in the Beaches, East York area are at 34%. Just on the other side of Coxwell in Toronto Danforth, it's 33%. In Beaches, East York, 6.6% of the populace is considered Black. Toronto Danforth at about 5%. The Black population in particular are having the worst healthcare experiences, lacking access to healthcare, facing high rates of illness such as HIV, diabetes, stress-related illnesses like health disease and hypertension. This then leaves the population at a higher risk of contracting and dying from COVID-19. Nutisha, I'm gonna start with you. I know the racialized community makes up about 51% of the population in Toronto, and I wanted to kind of allow the audience to understand why race-based data and collecting that information is so important to combat or help to combat anti-Black racism within our communities.
Absolutely. I didn't get the memo that we changed how we were going to start, so I was ready for the other question, Lanrick. But okay, let's just jump right in here.
Yes.
So a lot of my research is specifically around race-based data collection, how you do it, and then how it's used to improve health outcomes for Black people specifically in the country and Toronto as a whole. The first thing to understand is that almost 50% of all Black people in Canada live in the GTA. And so it's very important for us to understand what the experiences are of Black people in Toronto specifically, because that's where half of all of us in the country, 1.2 million of us, half of us live in the GTA. And we make up 8.8% of the total population of the city. So our neighborhood is just a little bit below the city whole of 8.8%, but these numbers matter. When we are fighting, and I call it fighting because that is what it has been, to push for the city to collect race-based data on every service, anything that we touch, so that we understand, are we accessing those services as Black people? And how are we treated when we access those services? And are the services effective enough for our well-being? It's very important. And we're seeing it with COVID, where we know that Black and racialized and Indigenous communities are overrepresented in the COVID numbers, but the city hasn't been able to produce those exact figures for us, to even let us know that we're at higher risk for COVID. Our community has had, to date, about 30 cases of COVID, or 30 deaths due to COVID out of the 1,500. And as a Black woman, as a Black family, I've lost 2 aunts in the GTA to COVID. And if I don't understand personally our overrepresentation in the COVID numbers as a case in point, I personally have felt it. And you have to understand the reasons why, and we can talk about that today. I'll give you a very clear-cut example that I use, especially when I'm teaching race-based data collection. And I teach quantitative and qualitative research at Ryerson. When we were looking at HIV statistics for the city of Toronto, the health center that I was running had an overrepresentation of Black women living with HIV. But I had no evidence to explain to me why did we have so many women who identified as Black also identifying as HIV positive. And our health center had over 500 cases. It's the most cases of women living with HIV in one health center in the city. We went to Ontario Public Health and asked for the data. They gave us the data, and the data showed that in terms of gender, 80% of new HIV infections were male and about 20% were female. I asked Ontario Public Health to desegregate the data based on race. And it's one of the few institutions in the city that can actually do this because they do collect race-based data for HIV infection. When they desegregated based on race, and this was a personal request, what came back was in the Black community, the Black population in the database, it's almost a 50-50, 50% male, almost 50% female with HIV infection, as opposed to the general population, which is 80-20. I asked them to pull out women only. And when you look at all women who have contracted HIV in the last 3 years, for the city of Toronto, 70% were Black. When you don't desegregate data, you don't get to that piece of information to know that this is a population at high risk for HIV. We need to redirect resources to that community. We need to redevelop prevention strategies for that community. We need to increase funding in terms of healthcare and access for that community. And it's very buried when you don't desegregate data. And I always use that as an example because it's so prevalent. When I asked them to show me what the whole province looked like, every region of this province, Black women were the highest percentage of new HIV infections, with 52% being the lowest in any region. And on average, we were about 60 to 70% of all new HIV infections without any indication that we are part of a pandemic that is very specific to Black people. So that's an example of why race-based data is so important. It tells you what to do as service providers. It tells you where to focus your priority. It tells you how to address an issue. And the same thing is going to happen with COVID. If we don't understand which populations are at high risk, which populations are dealing with COVID in a more profound manner, we're not going to be able to eliminate COVID from our existence in the city.
Okay, thank you. Cheryl, I'm going to pivot from health to housing. And I'm hoping that you can give the audience, maybe just explain what are the things that Black and non-Black people, what should they know about housing here in the city, housing here in the East End? What's important that they need to kind of hone in on?
Yeah, so when it comes to housing, I think we don't often enough think about, how did these houses come to be, right? They didn't sprout from the ground. There's no housing seed or housing fertilizer. That's not a thing. And so, you did a land acknowledgement, And, I practice a human rights approach to planning. So just bringing that up again and showing how these relate to housing. We're having this conversation because we're in a period of reckoning with the systemic racism that is entrenched within our society. When in the context of Canada and Toronto, it was colonized and it was described as terra nullius, right? Empty land, despite there being Indigenous nations here, having their own culture and societies here. And the Indigenous people, their values of land and land use are not reflected at all in the way that our city has been developed, right? Even from the jump point of the British and the French colonies coming to this land and purchasing this land in 1805 for the price of 10 pounds of bread, Toronto itself was purchased for the price from Victoria Park all the way to the Etobicoke Creek for the price of 10 pounds of bread. They bought this land. We can be certain under conditions of duress, where the Indigenous people were not given full, permission to consent in a safe condition to turn down that offer. And then the British and the French put forward their plans for how the land would be developed and privatized, and that tradition of privatizing land and not actually consulting people who are described as other, right? Again, I mentioned that just people their views are not, their cultural values are not embedded in how we've planned these cities and how these houses have been developed. That's why Indigenous people are amongst the most underhoused communities. And this comes back to the conversation around as Black people, Africa itself is one of the most pillaged continents in the world, right? There are genocides that have not even been talked about, that we're only learning about recently because of George Floyd's murder. We're kind of coming upon this knowledge about how millions of Africans have been murdered under just one king alone. He decided he would take up this space and kill these people from a specific nation. And in Canada, or in Toronto, sorry, a lot of Black Canadians, for example, come from the Caribbean, right? The Caribbean. How did Black people come to the Caribbean? They came by slave ships, right? They came by slave ships. I'm Jamaican, so I can give a Jamaican example. So Jamaican slave ships, the Spanish arrived in Jamaica 1494. They essentially killed off all the Indigenous people of that island, through slavery and through bringing their disease. So essentially by genocide, all Indigenous Jamaicans, Arawakans, were, dead by 1600s. And then that led to a period of about 300 years of slavery, where Jamaican people were enslaved. So then, you think about what does this have to do with anything, right? It's the fact that these are the legacies of our housing policy, right? And that today, and even of our income policy and of our economy itself. So let me just pull this stat here. So looking at when it comes to Black people, on average, Black people make about $35,000 a year. White individuals make about $75,000 a year. How are you going to compete? And why do we make less? It's because we're not respected. We're not respected. We're talented. We're talented people. We're very talented people. We're just not respected. We're treated lesser than. That's the core of racism. It's not really that we're hated. It's that we're disrespected, and despite our value, we are treated lesser than. So we are paid less, and we are given less. We are accepted into less opportunity and to less positions of leadership. And then, how do these things translate into home ownership? So to go back again into the Indigenous people, the original inhabitants of this land. Only 16% of Indigenous households own their property. That's compared to 49% of French and 48% of British. when you think about for Black households, it's 34% of Black households own their home compared to 49% of French, and again, 50% of British. So, you know, we're in the environment where we're dealing with the legacies of these policies that actually have never been addressed, right? And that's why I'm so glad to be able to be invited into these rooms where we can bring these up, right? And like really dig deep into thinking about how can we address these policies. So, so these are, I guess, the things I bring forward.
So continuing with that then, I mean, there is a disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on the Black community. What does housing, how does housing have a human right? What does that look like to Black people in your eyes?
Yeah, well, I think that you asked two questions there, so I'll ask, it's okay. I'll answer the first one. So you talked about the impact of COVID and housing. So the impact of COVID and housing, it's a bit of a funny one. So, you know, Black people, due to how we are perceived and due to the process of racialization, oftentimes we self-select into positions of care. So for example, many women work as nurses, right? There's no shortage of nurses positions, right? So that may not be those who did go into those spaces won't be impacted as much. But generally speaking, we are employed in positions that are lower paid, less likely to be able to work from home, right? So even if you are able to work, you know, you're a nurse, you're working in one of the most unsafe environments. You're coming back to your household and you're then making your family, you're putting your family at risk, right? So thinking about the issue that, you know, as a government and as a society, we haven't put forward a COVID response that has, you know, made it easy for people to work and then to keep their family safe, right? Like we could have opened up hotels for nurses. We could have done something. We actually done, I would describe nothing, like to any standard of effectivity, right? We've been going on this COVID business for 4 months now when we were told it might be a month or 2 months. Like New Zealand has no more COVID, right? And so the second question, I believe, was how does this relate to human rights? So under the United Nations, there actually are policies that describe housing as a human right and that describe that governments have a responsibility of upholding human rights as a standard and providing policies and programs to provide housing access to all peoples regardless of any condition outside of their control. What kinds of conditions are outside of one's control? That race, right? Gender, receipt of public assistance, there are many. Canada has signed an agreement with the United Nations saying that they uphold that standard. The Ontario Human Rights Commission in Ontario also has policies that describe Ontario as a provincial jurisdiction as upholding that standard. Where we fall apart is the issue is this issue of systemic discrimination. I'm very much a firm believer of the fact that you can have, you know, having statements is fantastic, but when you have people in the boardroom and you have people in C-level suite positions, in management positions who don't actually care, like if I'm being frank, they don't really care. They don't prioritize human decency and dignified living for people. The United Nations, whatever they're saying, doesn't really matter. And so where we really need to, like, fundamentally within our hearts, I believe, you know, people who are predispositioned to believe in the decency of human beings, them deserving to have access to dignified living. Those people, they don't need the United Nations to tell you that, you know, human rights include access to housing. But like we just need to get to the systemic issue of how do we get people in positions of power to do the right thing, and part of that is again having these types of conversations and to build support around those who are looking for change.
Natisha, I'm going to touch on something that Cheryl said about bias, and I'm going to read a quote that you gave, and this was This was about an article that was entitled "Racial Bias Reaches the Tipping Point in Canada's Health System." And you were quoted saying, "We're finding that particular members of the Black communities are going into spaces where they're not only not well, but they're also experiencing racism, which is only going to increase issues around mental health, stress, and just their family's health in general." How, not just how do you see this, but do we have any policies that are working to change that? Is there anything that is going forth that may allow that to get better? I know that's a big question.
So what I was talking about, if I remember that particular interview, was the fact that you can get to a health service, but how you're treated once you get to the health service has just as much impact on your health and well-being as the illness that you were going there in the first place to address. You know, the formula I like to use if I'm trying to explain to people what the issue is, you know, as a Black person, when I'm in my home, oftentimes race and culture will determine when I understand myself to be ill, right? So we all, you know, whether it's your home culture, whether it's your family, whether it's, you know, ethnicity, all those things will determine how you understand what being well is and not being well is. When I decide to leave my home to get assistance, racism, and particularly anti-Black racism, will determine who I go to first. Who do I trust? Who's the first person I call? Oftentimes for Black people, it's not the healthcare system, it's a friend, it's somebody else they trust, a pastor if you're a person of faith. Sometimes it's the education system. For youth, sometimes it's the internet. So those are the places where I go to first, but anti-Black racism mitigates that immediately. Anti-Black racism in the city also determines how far the health service is from my home. We're very lucky. In neighborhoods that have high proportions of racialized individuals, health services are not actually near their homes where they live. You can map it out in the city. A lot of our services are in the downtown core for health. We are very lucky in our neighborhood to have an amazing hospital, Michael Garron Hospital. We don't necessarily have that issue. But when I look at the entire city, how health services are mapped out, neighborhoods that have high percentages of immigrants, refugees, racialized communities have the lowest percentage of healthcare services. So racism determines how far the service is from my home. It's going to determine if I have the resources financially to get there.
Right.
And racism is going to determine when I get there how I'm treated. So am I welcomed? Am I going to experience racism upon arrival in the intake process? But racism also impacts my relationship or my engagement with the healthcare provider. And the bias that I was talking about is the issue that once you finally get inside the healthcare service, we have a situation where, if one study I can speak to, 80% of the Black people who responded in a particular survey had identified experiencing racism, direct racism from the healthcare provider who is providing them service, being called racial slurs, racial stereotypes in terms of, I don't believe that you're in pain right now, even though you have sickle cell. I believe you are pretending to have that pain because you just want the narcotics. You know, those are the kinds of stories that people are telling us. You don't need this epidural because Black women are perceived of as having the strength to deliver naturally and tolerate pain. So you don't need this epidural. Those are the kinds of biases that we're experiencing in the healthcare system. And racism determines what condition we're sent back home in. in the formula that I look at. So that's what I was talking about in terms of the bias that we experience. What happens with repeated exposure to racism in the healthcare system, Black people tend to opt out of going for health services until it's absolutely crucial or too late. And in the health center that I ran, 45% of Black clients came when the chronic illness was already in full effect. So the diabetes was already present. They hadn't done any prevention screening. The cancer was already in full effect. Because you've avoided going to health services due to the racism that you've experienced along the way. And so you elect out of those services. And those are the things that we have to change. We have to ensure that every member of our society, we have free healthcare in Canada, right? Free healthcare. So that should not be a barrier. But why is it that Black people are not able to access the services? And when they finally do, why are they not treated properly when they're accessing services? And then you also have the issue where healthcare providers are not trained enough to understand what some of the specific issues are that we are dealing with. Black women, for example, have the highest rates of cancer, but we develop, let's say breast cancer, if I use that as an example, we develop it faster, earlier, but our cancer screening doesn't start until post 50. I let people know I did get my notice to remind me to go for my breast cancer screening. So I'm very well aware that, you know, that moment when you're 50 and you get we all get these notices, right? You need to go for your colon cancer screening, your breast cancer screening, etc. It's too late for some populations, but we've done no research. We do not look at how different communities and populations, in particular Black people, are experiencing illness and poor health, and how do we adjust our healthcare system to accommodate for the diversity of the people who live in our community.
I just want to pick up on what Natisha was saying as it relates to the urban planning housing space. So, you know, one of the points that Nisha made was about how Black people self-select out of opportunities to improve their health because that process, that program itself was actually hurting them, right? Like they don't go to healthcare because the healthcare system was itself hurting them. I can give you, you know, a personal example of how that worked for me in the urban planning industry. So Landmark earlier gave you a description of, you know, the diversity of the region. To recap, the city of Toronto is about 51% non-white and about 8% Black. The planning industry is about, you know, this is my assessment off of, you know, reviewing a couple of firms, about maybe 2 to 3% Black. 2 to 3% Black compared to the city again being 8 to 9% Black. So to give you a background on myself and how I started, you know, entered into the space. So I'm 25 now, quarter life, getting there. And so I graduated from Ryerson University's planning program in 2017. I took a very practical approach to my undergrad, and when I graduated, I released a report on my, voluntarily talking about the vibrancy of neighborhoods. And this report got the attention of Toronto Star, of various magazines. I was on radio and things like that. People are really excited about the research that this person had produced. Me, right? And then I'm like, fantastic, I'm gonna get a job out of this. I'm so excited to help people with my education. I got no job offers, none. No one wanted to hire me. I had hundreds of applications sent out and many opportunities for people to see me. I was on panels, etc. I even at one point I was invited to a conference where a white male, in his 50s, had up on display my map, a map that I had produced as an undergrad, him presenting it to a room full of well-paid planning industry people and making no acknowledgement that the map was produced by me. Thankfully, I'm a very hardworking individual. I will note I did have, my own privileges. My parents own housing. I never struggled to, have a roof over my head and a bed under my back, to rest at night. But the idea that despite my hard work, I could not be employed in this industry made me feel very much like I should leave this industry. And I did for many months think I should just, go ahead and be working in a grocery store for the rest of my life because this industry doesn't want me. So despite, this being in my head and the depression that comes with that, I pushed on and I was able to get grants to do projects and to develop this human rights approach to planning, develop amazing relationships with people in access to power who were like, wow, this girl is brilliant. And it's still not enough to actually maintain myself. And I was sitting in a room with a very well-established planning firm looking for full-time employment because, like anybody else, I have my individualistic goals. I want to have, to not worry about where my next check is coming from. I want to have a roof over my head of my own, not my parents. I currently don't live with my parents anymore, but these are the things that a young person stresses about. And so I'm in this interview room with this person, very, very well-connected, powerful planning firm. And they said to me, Cheryl, this is actually after, again, I had done a citywide community engagement strategy with 5 neighborhoods across the city of Toronto, including East York, Etobicoke Lakeshore, Parkdale, Scarborough, Weston, all these neighborhoods independently on my own, coordinated with all of these communities to do this work. I had released I'm a co-author, publisher, co-author, editor of a book on housing. All of these things. CMHC had flown me out to Ottawa to talk on a panel on housing. All of these things. Relationships with foundations. This planning firm said to me, Cheryl, how about you accept a lower starting salary than our posted average salary? So they wanted me to offer a lower, they wanted me to offer to myself to be paid less than their posted salary because I didn't have a master's degree, which actually doesn't mean, a bag of bones or anything really, considering my experience and my connections. They ended up hiring 2 white males to work for them after denying me employment. And so this is, what we're dealing with when we're talking about systemic racism and also access to power, right? Tisha, her wonderful Black friends, my wonderful Black friends, there's many beautiful Black talented people, Black people who've gone to nursing school, who've gone to med school even, who know how to take care of a Black person, right? Like Natisha's talking about how when you're a Black person, when you have a medical condition, you're not treated the same as anybody else. Black people know this, and the same goes in employment, and the same goes in any other space. And so the policies and the people who are in positions of power, straight up, either they're racist in terms of how they've been socialized, and they're not aware that they're devaluing the experience and the humanity of people that look like us, or they're racist in that they don't care to learn, and they're very proud, secretly proud, that they can deny us service. I just wanted to say that.
Yeah. Lanrick, I'll just add one thing. So, your question was about policy. Yeah. And Cheryl, thank you so much for sharing that, because I think the personal experience, right, the lived experience is where a lot of expertise rests when we listen to the stories. But in lieu of not having policies, one of the things that we have to do is get very granular in neighborhood data. And so one of the things that I look at is to try and map what are the health issues per neighborhood. And I'll use our neighborhood, for example. We have one of the highest rates of low birth weight babies for the racialized population in our neighborhood. And low birth weight baby, and anyone who understands when life begins with a struggle, preemies, for example, or low birth weight babies, there's long-term consequences. So your goal is to reduce that percentage. We haven't had enough research to understand why and why it shows up in certain neighborhoods, for example, but that was an issue for our community. East Toronto and our community was in there. One of the things that we did to offset that was to partner with the midwifery practice at Michael Garron Hospital so that we could bolster prenatal care to make sure that everyone in our neighborhood had access to a midwife if they needed it. We had quite a number of residents who didn't have health coverage in our community as well that kind of go unnoticed. How do we get them linked up very early to care, especially prenatal care? And Michael Garron Hospital and the midwifery practice really stepped up and developed an excellent program that focuses on racialized communities. Primarily Black women are accessing that service. They're able to leverage it even outside of our parameters of our neighborhood to say, you know what, we're doing such a great job. We can take in some more people from outside the community, and they sit with us in detail to look at what are the specifics that we need to do to ensure healthy deliveries for your population. And I think in lieu of the policies not coming forward, what we have to do is develop best practices and best neighborhood practices. And to do that, we need to really understand who's in our neighborhood, how they're living, how they're situated, what are the risks, who's at risk, and map that out and find, you know, what are the best services that we can offer the members of our community. And I really applaud DECA for engaging in this conversation because we often don't have opportunities to have our politicians present to really sit down and think about, have you mapped out who's in our neighborhood, who's not? What are some of the reasons why people may not elect to be in our neighborhood or can't be in our neighborhood for whatever reason? And think about it in terms of race. I'll stop there because I'm sure you've got other questions for us.
Cheryl, was your hand up to kind of comment on that?
No.
No. Okay. So Cheryl, I want to go back to you then and kind of what's allowed you then to succeed? What and I know you talked a bit about, you know, you're a hard worker. I get that, but how do you thrive? How are you able to support others? How are you able to start shifting the conversation so that it's a win for Black and racialized the Black and racialized communities in the city?
I mean, if I'm going to give you the real answer is when I get paid to do the things that need to be done. The best.
And how important is being paid for what you do?
It's the most important thing. It is. We put, like, you know, they say vote with your dollar, right? Like we're putting a lot of money into things that are not necessarily getting us to where we need to go. If I may say that, just pointing blank, right? And when it comes to like me practicing a human rights approach to planning, the way that I even came across this approach was extremely novel. The idea when I first came about it was, let's see what happens when I listen to marginalized people and I prioritize them in my planning work. And then I came across this human rights framework and I'm like, this is amazing. I didn't realize how controversial it would be to do that. You know, this is someone who, you know, they teach you in school, care about people, care about your community, and then somehow that gets lost when you come into the workforce as an adult. I've not lost that, and I know many of us here haven't lost that. Many of us here, perhaps, who work in these industries, and we got into them because we wanted to help people. I know many of us feel disheartened because the system itself prevents us from doing the work that is necessary. I mentioned earlier about having managers and board members who don't care about addressing systemic racism. That is, at the end of the day, the biggest problem that we need to confront, right? Like, and I'm very fortunate to have within myself this natural drive to keep going and this like mouth on me to say the things that are on my mind. I'm also very fortunate that there are people out there who are similarly, you know, enraged about the fact that, you know, women who are pregnant are being, and Black women, even, you know, I heard a specific case that was given to me. A friend of mine told me about this Black woman who was evicted from her house just after giving birth to her baby. I think that is disgusting, that in this society, in this day and age, with the amount of wealth out in the world, and with the amount of love and compassion that I know is amongst us as human beings, and as like, we don't need to have this happen. We don't need to have this happen. The issue is that, again, most times and in most spaces, we are not made to feel comfortable to speak about these things. And so, you know, I have many conversations with people who are in positions of power who come to me and say, Cheryl, you know, how can I help you, right? Or they'll say, Cheryl, apply for this grant, right? And one of the things that I take onto myself as like my own, you know, one of the reasons why we don't talk about these things is because we're oftentimes afraid of, you know, what can happen if we speak up and whatever, right? And I know for myself, like, I actually haven't done I haven't done as much as I could do, because I myself even have my own limits in terms of what I need to do to keep myself feeling safe, right? And so I've been many grants I haven't written. In my lifetime, I've written, I think, 3 or 4 grants. I'll probably say I've won 2 of those grants, which is, I think, a pretty high win rate, right? But like, there's many grants I haven't written because I've been too busy doing other things for other people, and in those spaces not having the voice to actually speak on behalf and support the community. So that's really the thing. So if you are somebody who's, you know, there's about 70+ people in this room, if you are concerned with the condition of housing, you're concerned with the fact that, you know, the planning process doesn't speak to the interests of lower income and marginalized people, you know, my contact at Cheryl Case, I'm on Twitter, case.cheryl@gmail.com. Like, let me know, because I'm actually getting super frustrated. Like, with the murder of George Floyd and the escalating state violence, and, you know, one of the things I'll note is, like, you know, as an individual, there's a need to be like tactful in your approach, right? Like, I played a long game, and I'm like, okay, this is a long game. I'm gonna be polite and like bring things to light in a way that is comfortable for people. And I thought I had more time. I thought there was more, the people in power had more decency. Turns out a lot of people in power, very indecent, right? A lot of people in power, perhaps they're decent people, but they also, A, thought they had more time, or B, they don't see someone providing the answers that are needed to get us to where we need to go. And so, considering, you know, George Floyd's murder, escalating state violence that we're seeing in the States, I don't know if people are checking out Portland, like, Canada has not condemned any of that. That is essentially us saying it's okay, by the way, right? Like, as a state, right? And, you know, people, COVID going on is seemingly, you know, without any end date. Housing, we thought COVID would mean that housing prices would go down. I was looking forward to buying a house. I'm like, I'm gonna buy myself a house. Housing prices haven't gone down, right? Where are we going? So, so like, that's kind of where I'm at. It's like really looking to just jump into that space of, I'm trying to find out and find resources and people who are looking to put this as a priority, and to understand, like, we had less time than we thought we did.
Yeah. Natisha, you got to sit on, you were the co-chair for the Anti-Racism Advisory Panel for the Toronto Police Service Board. And thinking about what has been going on in the States, what has been going on here in Toronto. And we're not going to get into the massive discussion of defunding the police unless we need to, but I want to ask just point blank, within the confines of mental health, why is it that our police, why does that not work when they are interacting with that sort of health silo within mental health? Why do those two why don't those two work?
So I'm still the co-chair of the Anti-Racism Advisory Panel of Toronto Police Services Board until August 19th. So everything I'm saying now is still under that hat, but it has never.
That's fine.
Yeah, it has never stopped me from saying what I need to say.
It wouldn't.
So first and foremost, we don't call the police first for any other health information. So I don't understand why police will be the first responders for a mental health crisis. We don't call them when we're having a heart attack, when we've broken our leg, for any other health crisis. So they are the least trained to respond to a mental health crisis. So I'll say that first, that's my opinion. The Anti-Racism Advisory Panel has one sole purpose, which is to implement the Andrew Loku inquest recommendations that were made by the community and by the members of the inquest panel. And if those of you who may not know, very quickly, Andrew Loku was a Black man. He was an African immigrant who had mental health issues. He was living in assisted mental health housing, and he was having a mental health crisis. The police were called, and within less than a minute of arrival, seconds of arrival, he was shot dead. He was only holding a hammer. He was of no danger to anyone in that particular situation. There was no de-escalation. There was no intervention in any way. He was shot dead within seconds of police arriving. And the inquest was called. No one was charged. No one was held responsible for that death. So the inquest first recommended that the police board put together an anti-racism advisory panel, experts who could advise them on mental health and race and how those things intersect, and to direct the police in terms of moving away from ever having that experience again. What has happened before we give our final report on August 19th is Regis Korchenski-Paquette was killed or has died. We haven't gotten the results as yet from SIU. So before, and Mr. Ijaz Chowdhury, although it's a different jurisdiction, and Chantel Moore, and there were many other people who also have come forward, their families have come forward, who didn't make it into the media as well, who upon police arrival for a wellness check to support them with a mental health crisis, ended up dead. I don't know how many of those you need to understand that the police cannot be part of a mental health response in this city. And so our panel is highly recommending that not be the case, that funds be redirected from police service, and you can call it whatever you want, right? Restructuring, all the way up to defunding, depending on where you sit on that argument. But the funds have to be removed from police services in terms of redirecting those funds to develop mental health responses that are for the community and by the community. So that's where we are. We're going to have our recommendations to tell you. It's taken us 3 years to work with TPS to even get to a place of being able to give this final report. And within those 3 years, people have continued to die. So there hasn't been movement. We haven't seen TPS move in any positive way to end the issue that brought us there in the first place. We also have had one success, and that is with the mandating of race-based data to be collected on any interaction that the police have with the public. And that was instituted on January 1st. It is the first policy in Canada for any police service to mandate the collection of race-based data. So I'm very proud of that work. But I'm very disillusioned to end this work knowing that other people died before we even gave the final report. And there has not been any solid will on behalf of the police service to change the course or change the direction that they're on in terms of digging their heels in and wanting to be part of that mental health response when we know it has only meant death for Black people and racialized people.
Teacher, one last thing, and this kind of brings us back literally to the beginning of you just talking about race-based data. I've had people tell me that this is reverse racism, that how dare they just be able to collect information for Black people? Why can't they collect information for everyone? How it's so skewed and so screwed that people would think that, but I'd like to give them a solid answer as to not just how dare you, but here's exactly why that is so important.
So just to clarify, the race of any individual, not just Black people, so the race of everybody will be identified. So when you get stopped by the police for any reason, your address, your, the other identifiers about you, your gender is taken into account, your eye color, all kinds of things are documented. They now have a list of ethnic and racial identities that they have to choose from. There's two things that we're measuring. One is implicit bias. So when Andrew Loku was murdered by the police, when they showed up within seconds, right? No questions asked, nothing. They saw a Black man with a hammer. Implicit bias kicked in. I perceive that person to be dangerous and overly so. And I have to exert the maximum amount of pressure possible because my bias that I've been trained with understands that that Black man is the most dangerous thing that I am being confronted with right now. So when we're asking the police officers to note the race of the person, we're checking implicit bias. So I can measure what race you thought the person was and what did you do with that person in that situation. We're also asking for self-identification, where people get to identify for themselves what their race is. With that measure, what we're looking at is overrepresentation of different racialized groups in particular types of police interactions. So use of force, where the police have to use a weapon, right? I said earlier, based on the police data that we've been able to look at so far, Black people are 20 times more likely to be killed by a police officer. So when people push me on that issue, right, reverse racism, I said there's only one group of people who are dying at the hands of the police at this level.
Right.
That's Black people. So that's what I'm concerned about.
Yeah.
I'm concerned about preserving the lives of Black people. And we have to do whatever it takes to hold the police responsible, to monitor them, because this data is going to be monitored by sources outside of police service and fed back to them. There's a new report going to be coming out in a few weeks, and I'm going to implore everyone to take a look at it. And it's another Human Rights Commission report based on the data so far, and you will be able to look at all kinds of details of how Black people are treated by the police in this city. And it's very important for us to understand it. And people can argue with me all they want about why we shouldn't collect it and how it's going to be used against us and all those things. But all I can tell you is that currently Black people are dying at the hands of the police unnecessarily. And we have to do things to monitor it and hold the police service accountable.
Cheryl, do you want to, and I'm putting you on the spot on this, but is there a piece that works against the Black community when it comes to housing and their interactions with the police?
Oh, I mean, there's a definite intersection. So speaking about Regis, so Regis fell off, was pushed off, you know, to be determined via process, the balcony of a TCHC building in High Park. And that TCHC building is actually known to have frequent visits from the police. And you think about, you know, why is it that there's such a frequent visitation of police in that building? You know, that could be for a variety of reasons. One thing that we do know is that tenants of TCHC housing are more likely to have mental health needs, right? The condition of the housing itself is so substandard to a point where, you know, you could imagine a person even in themselves developing or having triggered their mental health, you know, issues, right? You know that some mental health issues are not just they develop, they actually can be triggered by environmental and, you know, life experiences. There's actually a history of people jumping out the building, off the balconies of that building, too much to the point where there's like there's been requests for netting underneath the balcony. So there's a direct connection between housing and the police. To bring it further into a broader perspective beyond that building itself, you know, why is it that people who live in lower income housing or TCHC housing have to live in towers, right? Why is it that if you have been neglected opportunity to a decent income, if you don't come from a family background of wealth, that you must live in a high-rise building? You know, that's something that we should be investigating, right? Like a lot of the towers that are going up, single bedroom units are the ones that are able to be sold because that's the only thing that the market is providing in terms of affordable, right? But those are the ones that actually provide individuals with the least amount of access to resources required for healthy living, right? That could be even as simple as green space, right? Being able to walk into a park or a backyard, to sit by a tree, right? So there's a definite intersection. And going back again to TCHC, like Black people are overrepresented in TCHC housing, and there's this whole culture in that space that makes it difficult for people to come out of that environment.
Talk to me about that. Talk to me about that culture. Talk to me about why you're feeling that it's so hard for that community to move outside of TCHC.
Yeah. So this is not an area that I would say I have expertise in about like the culture. So I've spoken to people who you know, do have expertise in that space, and so I can share the little that I've heard from them, and I guess relate it to my own experience in regards to engaging with most marginalized people. So from my own experience, and I think something that we can even, many of us know generally, is that people who are marginalized feel less entitled to participate and to demand things, right? Like people who are wealthy feel more entitled to demand things. So in TCC housing, these are amongst the most marginalized people. And so there's not really a culture of feeling independent within TCC housing. And so that plays out in perhaps a variety of ways, but most specifically, I was given an example of how it plays out in TCC housing, where I was told an example where a TCHC resident asked TCHC if they, the individual, can apply for a grant that had nothing to do with TCHC. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like this culture of where people are not made to feel like independent, and so that's something that needs to be addressed within that. Not sure that answers the question.
No, it does. It does hit on the right theme. I'm just going to throw this out to the audience in general. If you do have a question that you would like to put forward, you can email info@deca.to, and we will we'll see if we can answer the question that that you may have. Ladies, I'm going to put this to both of you in general of I hate putting it even in this context, but what are you seeing as the next steps for housing, for mental health? Where do we need to go on the community side, and then maybe just touching briefly on the policy sides of the province or the feds? Matisha, where's your headspace on those next steps?
I mean, the most immediate pressing thing right now is the recommendations that we will be putting forward on August 19th at the Police Services Board meeting. We were following very closely, and thank you so much, Brad Bradford, for your City Hall fight. You know, the request for a 10% reduction was not a big one, and so one of the things that we're going to try and do as we push forward our recommendations to the board for approval is at least 10% being removed from the budget and put into the crisis unit response teams. You know, some of the work that we have to do is work in collaboration with our politicians, who I think we are very fortunate in our community to have such strong leadership politically. And that is not always the case on the issue of anti-Black racism and the impacts that it's having. So we have to absolutely look at that and how we're going to work and inform our politicians on the things that we need to move forward specifically as it pertains to the Black community in our neighborhood. So those are the big things. Mental health and policing for sure is not going to leave us, and we have to figure out a different strategy that is community based. We have to look at what are the resources we have in our community currently to support people living with mental health. You know, one of the things I want to take a look at is mapping out what do we have in our neighborhoods and make sure that we're advocating for more. I'm sure we don't have enough, but we need to figure out what we do have and what is working and what is not working. The other issue is absolutely addressing systemic racism and systemic anti-Black racism and how it plays out at a neighborhood level. And this is where DECA is going to come in. Do we know what are the experiences of Black people living in our neighborhood? You know, I'll give you, I've lived in this community for over 20 years. During the last election, federal election, I was coming home from work, so I'm walking off the streetcar and walking home along with other people who had gotten off the streetcar, and two canvassers were talking to people and stopping them along the way. And they walked past me and went to my neighbor and said, you know, we're talking to homeowners in the community and, you know, about the upcoming election and blah, 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 right? I was tired, so I'm like, okay, fine, you don't want to talk to me, that's great. I went to my home, and maybe about 20 minutes later, the doorbell rings, and it's the same two canvassers who passed me on the street, who are now at my door to talk to the homeowner. So I asked them, why didn't you speak to me on the street? Like, you walked past me. I mean, they were a bit shocked, but I'm like, you walked right past me to speak to my white neighbor, and you didn't consider me to be a homeowner that you wanted to speak to, or someone from this community, or someone who's lived here much longer than the person you passed me to go and speak to. You know, those are the kinds of experiences of exclusion on a very neighborhood level that we have to address and tackle. Don't worry, it was nobody on this call. It wasn't your canvassers, and they weren't with a winning party, so good. But it's about how do you make Black people feel included in your community, right? What is the level of racism that we're experiencing that might marginalize us and make us feel excluded? You need us to feel included. Parts of being healthy are acceptance, and it's part of our well-being. We need to feel like we belong, or else it's very difficult to function. The rest of the world is extremely, extremely racist against us. You don't want to come home to your neighborhood and have to deal with it on a very local level as well. And I think it's really important. And that, as many of us have children on this call, you also want to make sure that your children are not experiencing this, that they are made to feel that they're part of this community. And I think we all have to work together to make a decision that, you know, Danforth East is going to be a safe, welcoming place for Black members of Toronto. And that takes a lot of work, and that's beyond policy. I think I spend a lot of time in my head with numbers and policy and trying to address very large systems and systemic change. When I come home, I want to also know my neighborhood is that kind of place. And this is where we really do the work. This is where we make the change. This is where we make life different for our kids. You know, these are the experiences that I want to ensure that all Black people in our community feel like this is the place to live, and go and tell other Black people, hey, come and check us out. You know, my good friend, Zara Denani, she owns Old School store. Every Christmas she has Black Santa.
Black Santa.
I'm like a little kid. I'm in that line to have my picture taken every year with Black Santa. And I mean, it seems like such a small thing, but to be able to take my kid to a business in our neighborhood that is saying, you matter, representation matters, we care about you, is huge. Those are the kinds of things that I want to see. I can talk lots about policy, but I think we got to get right into, you know, the neighborhood issues and how do we ensure that Black people feel welcome in our space.
Cheryl, same question, that those next steps on the neighborhood level, and if you want to get into the other levels of government, what do you see as what pushes us forward?
Mm-hmm. I think what pushes us forward is, and I've had this principle of focusing on solutions, right? Like, we can sometimes get really caught up in, and I'm not to say this in any way to just take away from pressuring the people who are the problem causers, right? There's a need to put pressure on the people who are causing the problem, but just as more, if not more, attention needs to be put on solving the problem, because the person who is harming you, there's very likely, you know, to speak from a, you know, abuse perspective, the abuser is not going to stop abusing you because you ask them nice enough. Right? And so you need to understand that we need to be building solutions so we can take care of one another. And so the people that we look up to and look beside to are people who care about us, right? And so that's what we can do on the local level. It's really supporting people at the local level who are building solutions to take care of the community. And that I guess very specifically means supporting people who understand that systemic racism and systemic anti-Black racism is a problem, and it's a problem that we can solve together. And you have a great counselor here who I will note has selected, and this is me as the housing person, has selected the ward to be a test case for missing middle housing.
Talk, Cheryl. Just finish. No, you are. Finish that, and then I want you to explain what that term means.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah. So missing middle housing essentially just means any house structure that is allows for more than 2 families to live inside of it, right? It's more than just a detached house with a secondary suite. It's more than just a semi-detached house with a secondary suite. It's considered like a triplex to a 4-story apartment.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is a housing type that actually the City of Toronto has seen next to no development in over the past many decades. And so, considering that we're in a housing crisis and we're looking to change things up a bit, we've been exploring as a city to permit for this type, for, triplexes to 4-story houses to be built. Many of, I've walked the East York, and I know there's a lot of these houses in the neighborhood unofficially, right? You have these houses that have been cut up in the inside to create these separate units. Many of them are not actually legal to create any more of. And so what I would put forward is thinking about how policy, because the city already has a train of people ready to, I mentioned earlier how money is the most important thing. A bunch of people are ready to get paid to do some housing policy on this housing type. Make sure they get paid to make sure that housing type delivers for housing to be treated as a human right. That's what I would say. And so your resource for that on the local level would be Brad Bradford, who is a fellow urban planner.
Fair. No, fair. I've got a question that has come through, and this is Gratish. I'm going to see if I can find, or I'll have our DECA people unmute so that this question can be asked of. In one moment, please.
Hello?
Hello.
Hi, sorry, I didn't know I was going to be speaking. I thought I was just typing a question.
Oh, no problem.
Okay, so I live in Toronto housing at Main and Danforth. And so my question is, for the local representatives that are on this call, how many properties exist in this ward, and what are the individual relationships you guys have with these specific communities? Since we're talking about anti-Black racism, and also because we have so many immigrant families, specifically at Main and Danforth.
So again, your question is you're looking for our local representatives to give you kind of an answer on what their relationship is?
Yes, to these specific communities, yeah.
So why don't I'm just gonna go in order of, Nate, are you okay if I unmute you to give a quick answer to that?
Sure. It's a little bit difficult in the sense that there's not one community that lives at Main and Danforth. There's not one community that lives in Crescent Town. There's not one community. When you see these large buildings, whether you're wherever you are in the riding, and whether it's on Dawes, on Woodbine, and there are large building complexes, so if I think of our Bangladeshi community as an example, or our growing Nepali community, and many New Canadians, or our Ethiopian community, which is not the largest, but significant because we have an organization on Danforth near Woodbine as well. These are different communities that cross Crescent Town, Main, and Danforth, and beyond. And so I would say, in terms of connecting to the various communities, you try and connect with service providers and community organizations that are connected into those communities, including religious organizations that are connecting to those communities, and in some cases, connecting directly with in the case of Crescent Town, for example, being connected with people that sit on the board in Massey. And so you try to have a pulse of what's going on, people at the school in Crescent Town as an example. If I'm thinking Main and Danforth or on Eastdale, you're thinking of people who live in those buildings that you, again, can be in touch with to have a sense of what's going on. And then there are other, like, so if I think of service organizations and in some cases religious institutions like Grant Amy Church, again, just being connected with whether it is volunteers, people who live in the area, or local leaders in different ways. That would be how we largely, I would say, in our office, maintain a connection and get a sense of feedback of what's going on. And when there are programs that are relevant, we're able to reach directly in and connect with very different communities in these large buildings.
Thank you, Nate. Rima, is it okay if I unmute you to answer as well?
Thank you so much, Lenrick, and thanks for the question. I guess I'm not quite clear how you're asking the question, because I think, as Natisha was saying, I don't know what you mean by these communities, and I don't know exactly what you're asking. Are you asking about folks who live in apartment buildings like the ones at Main and Danforth? Obviously, so I would just slightly correct what Lenrick was saying, because in addition to the 34% that you were talking about in terms of Black and other racialized folks, there's also an additional 2% of folks in the riding who are self-identify as Indigenous. So about 36% BIPOC. And what we find in the office is that obviously some of the folks who are BIPOC are homeowners and quite well off, but many of there's obviously intersections between areas in the riding that are much more equity challenged, and a lot of BIPOC folks living there as well. And so that would be sort of Crescent Town, Main and Danforth, all up Dawes Road. And even then there are big differentials in terms of how people are living. So about 80%, and again, I just go back to, this is something that I'm highly attuned to, given my background and my own experiences, and the reason that I had been teaching at the University of Toronto, and the reason that I got talked into by former students running for office and to take on this role, which as an introvert is really pushing me, like, way out of my comfort level for sure, but was to make an impact in these areas. So about 80% of our casework is actually helping people deal with what I would call are the effects of white supremacy, and the definitely disparate issues that it has held. And that is everything from employment to people being able to graduate from universities, because there's obviously a lot of anti-Black racism, for instance, in academia. So to housing, to employment, to the way that COVID hit, to absolutely every area. So it's something that I spend a lot of time on. Also, I'm also the critic for poverty and homelessness. So one of the things that I rail about, and I've spent a lot of time actually trying to change the way that we talk about homelessness. The government has tried to portray it as something that happens to people who have made poor lifestyle choices. And my point is that that is actually not what happens, that this is actually the result of systems that push people who are largely, for the most part, Black and Indigenous into extreme poverty, into homelessness. And these systems start in school, and it's anti-Black racism in education. It's anti-Black racism in the criminal justice system and in policing, as we've talked about, and obviously in housing, and obviously healthcare, and the child welfare system, and all of these systems combined. And this is the place that it ends up. So I spend a lot of time really trying to shift that conversation. And obviously, of course, for me, I'm also a member of the NDP, the Official Opposition's Black Caucus. And so I do a lot of work on systemic racism with my colleagues, Laura May Lindo and Jill Andrew, Kevin Yard and Faisal Hassan. And that is actually proving to be a very powerful fivesome. We're actually making some real impacts. And I think it's just really important that we continue to have these very deep conversations, that we continue to keep exposing how these the fact that anti-Black racism is a public health crisis. When you break that down, what does that actually mean? What are all the pieces that cause? And you've heard a great many of them tonight, but we could go on for days talking.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Rima. Brad, I'm gonna unmute you just to add in a few minutes.
Yeah, thanks, Landrick. I'll be really quick, and I appreciate the question. I'm not sure if it's Toronto community housing specifically, but there are a number of tall buildings and apartment neighborhoods in Beaches East York. Toronto community housing is the largest landlord in the country, more than 61,000 units. We have 500 units in Beaches East York, combination of apartment buildings, mid-rise buildings, and what we call scattered houses, properties kind of across the board. So, for me, how I stay in touch with communities, prior to the pandemic, I would have town halls every other month as an in-person option. I think as things have translated online, what we're doing tonight, the call that we had with Michael Garron Hospital, calls we've had with Bengali community, like we're finding that there are different ways to connect, and actually it can be quite accessible for a lot of folks, not for everybody. And that's why I think we're learning now that we have to do it in different ways, and all the different ways that we can find to engage people. Local counselor, it's very much on the ground, working with the community. It's not glamorous. It's not necessarily high profile, but it's meetings, properties on Kingston Road, talking to residents about issues in the building, issues, that they're dealing with and they're struggling with, where Toronto community housing and the city is not meeting the mark. Talking about like even something as simple as a door that doesn't have a latch that's locked, so people are coming in and out of the building all the time. Like that's the level of granularity that I'm dealing with with neighbors and folks in some of these buildings. We had a really tragic shooting last fall up at Parma Court in Wakanda. Meeting with residents there, meeting with the school there. Michelle Arts joined me for that as well, talking to the principal, talking to folks in the buildings there. And it translates into a public meeting in the O'Connor Community Center with 200 people from Toronto Community Housing, from Parma Court, Wakanda, Teesdale. That's what it looks like. It looks like phone calls and emails and in-person meetings, increasingly online, listening to folks' issues and trying to coordinate and try our best to respond. But it's not easy. I think there's always more work to do. We can always do a better job. And frankly, I'm grateful to the community for engaging, because as our panelists, Natisha, Cheryl, Lanerick have talked about tonight, it takes a concerted effort from everybody. The fact that you have that feeling that we should be speaking out on it, that feeling of empowerment, whether, regardless of tenureship or ownership, like actually engaging in your community and feeling comfortable. And we all need to create an inclusive environment where everybody, feels comfortable speaking up to identify the issues and bring it to my attention and my colleagues' attention and try and get some action on it.
Thanks, Brad. Michelle, I'm going to unmute you. Oh, there we go.
Thank you. I think in terms of the community, for Maine and Danforth, the approaches are different from school to school when we look at a school level, because despite the fact that they're fairly close together, each of our schools in the area has actually quite a different demographic. So Crescent Town looks quite a bit different than Secord, looks quite a bit different than George Webster. There's some overlap, but then Kimberly's the next school over, which looks quite a bit different again. So there, a lot of the support works with the individual principals. So the principals in each school are tasked with serving the needs of that particular community. In that, Maine and Danforth Taylor Creek community is also where we have in the TDSB what are called our model schools. So model schools are schools that the TDSB decided in 2011 to start directing more resources and money. So it's additional staffing, maybe an additional vice principal, and additional community support workers, especially who work in those school communities. We have some really fabulous community support workers, especially for Secord O'Connor and Crescent Town, who's he does fabulous work, and so a lot of my connection around those communities is actually through the community support worker to as a like regular conversations about what do you need, like what do we need to move forward, what comes next, with respect to how the neighborhoods then impact the school. Then a lot of the conversations I have involve Brad's office. So some of the more recent ones involve childcare pressures, which are bad for the East End, but are going to get worse for the Main and Danforth neighborhood, which are under development. Looking at how we can have a better relationship between the schools and community centers, because even though some of them are attached together, it's not necessarily and historically that well coordinated. So how do we have a better a more interactive conversation about communities that we're both serving in those roles in those buildings. But I would say a big part of how the TDSB addresses the neighborhood piece is through the Model Schools program. And so that some examples, it's a lot more focus on getting the community into the school, a lot more focus on working together with parent staff and directly with parents to meet needs. A big part of what George Webster and Secord did when COVID broke out was actually to help coordinate food and access to some of our community programs. So on my personal side, I also volunteer with a neighborhood group, and so I shift different volunteering things. So I have, it's a nice connection, because a lot of our community support outside of the school that our principals access comes through the neighborhood group and Access Alliance as well. So it's a really good relationship between the schools there. George Webster actually has a pediatric clinic that's unfortunately not operating right now, but because of COVID. But there's a pediatric clinic for the community to provide more access to medical care for kids. So anybody who's a TDSB family member actually can access that clinic if their kids are under 18.
That's awesome. Thank you, Michelle. We have one last question because we are going to be wrapping up. And this is from Dara. Are you unmuted, Dara? There we go. Hi, Dara.
Hi. Hi. Yeah, I think this is less of a question and more of a me taking an opportunity to share my and my family's experience since moving to this neighborhood in 2012. So we've lived here for 8 years, just slightly more than 8 years. And I will say that we were very excited to move to this neighborhood when we bought our house. And right from day one, our first experience of this neighborhood was some of our new neighbors assuming that we were renting our house, even though it was very obvious, and they knew the people who lived here, and they knew that this house had just been sold. Instead of assuming that, oh, these are the new owners, some people, it was, oh, are you renting this house? And, we first had to say, no, we are the ones who purchased this house. It then went on to some people being taken aback that a Black family had just moved onto their street after, from what I understand, there had been some discussion of changing the name of the business improvement area. So yet again, that was another experience of people just giving off this vibe of being shocked and somewhat terrified that we had come to infiltrate their neighborhood.
Yeah.
And I'll say it hasn't been every single person, but there have been many experiences that we have had, both with, people who live in our vicinity and within the school that our two Black sons go to. We've had many race-tinged experiences. Our children are 6 and 3, and already there have been some extremely difficult situations for us to deal with. I know, Michelle, you've said that it's incumbent on the principals, but part of the problem is the principals are not held accountable. In this neighborhood, I can only speak to this neighborhood, they are not held accountable when they display anti-Black racism, when they are called out on it, when we as parents muster up the courage to speak out, to escalate issues to superintendents, and situations get worse and worse. The systems are not there to hold them accountable because the systems are inherently anti-Black. And it's hard for me to say this, but it's very true. There is severe systemic racism in this neighborhood, and severe systemic racism from this neighborhood translates into severe systemic racism that my family and other families that look like mine experience in the school system, that our children experience on the playground. So I was really hoping that this discussion was going to focus a little bit more on what the experiences of people in this community have been. I feel like this discussion has focused maybe a little bit too much on the policy side of things, and I completely agree, Natisha. The data is so important to help inform public policy decisions. I work in public policy myself. So all of that is very, very important. I would say what I would have liked to hear more in this discussion is, about what Black people are experiencing in this community, and what Notisha mentioned about her experience, your experience, Notisha, of the election canvassers passing you by. That feels very similar to, when we first moved here, and on day one, people assumed that we were renters, despite, having known that the house had just sold and the prior owners just moved out that day. There's a lot of that bias that people who are not Black and who are not BIPOC really need to dig deep within themselves to investigate and understand why they feel a certain way. I'll also mention that there was a few years ago, I was outside gardening and in my front yard, and two ladies passed by me. There were two Black ladies, and they said hello to me, and then they said to me, oh, they've just come back to the neighborhood that they grew up in. you know, to see what it's, because they had moved out to Hamilton at some point in their lives, and that's where they'd been living. But my street is the street they lived on growing up. And they were telling me that when they were living on this street, it was like a bastion of Blackness. There were Black families living all along our street. And what people who live here now don't understand is that this isn't, you know, for non-BIPOC people, this isn't just their community. There are people who have lived here over the course of history. There have been Greek people, there have been Black people, there have been people from all other backgrounds who are also part of this community. And we deserve to live here as much as you do, whether someone is renting or owning their home. We deserve the same consideration in when policy is being made for our community. We deserve to have a voice on things like the name of our BIA changing, which I will say I was quite disappointed to see that our name changed from Mosaic to the Danny. To me, that was a little bit more of the, let's suppress the diversity in the community by changing the name. I was not involved in those discussions, so I don't know what was discussed, but I'll say as a Black person living in this neighborhood, when I saw that change, I was taken aback. And I felt like it was a little bit of an attack on what this community could actually be, instead of, you know, preserving that sense of diverse community with the name of the BIA. It was changed to something more hipster, and more hipster translates to less diverse, actually. Some people may not think of it that way, but for those of us who maybe don't feel part of that hipster culture, you know, for me, the name spoke volumes about my experience in this neighborhood. Yeah, so all of that is to say, I just wanted to bring my voice to this discussion, let you know that Natisha is not alone in the experience of otherness that she has at times had in living in this neighborhood. There are many of us who feel like we are treated as other. There are many of us who feel, and to whom it has been expressed that, you know, if there's something that we don't like about this neighborhood or the schools in this neighborhood and how they are treating us and our children, that we should just leave this neighborhood. But it's extremely difficult and stressful, and the events of this year with George Floyd and others have, you know, they've added to that stress. It's wonderful to see people are speaking about the issues more. It's wonderful that there is this forum for this discussion. I think these forums need to continue to be very open and honest about the experiences of the BIPOC community in this neighborhood specifically.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so very much for giving us the realism of what it is that you're living through. Thank you. We're gonna run out of time in just a bit here, and I want to thank again DECA for providing the space for us. For Allison McMurray and Nicole, Rebecca and Michelle from DECA, thank you all very much. This is, I don't want this to be the end of the conversation, and these conversations really do need to continue and need to be brought down to the community level. Cheryl, Letitia, thank you so very much for your time this evening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's heavy, and I think you know, we're going to wrap up, but Dara has pushed you to the next level, and I mean, I think she's speaking for a lot of us, right? Like when I take out my garbage, I don't want to be thought of as the maid of the house. When I'm gardening, the gardener. I didn't even know you could have a remote car detailer until I was cleaning my car and someone asked for my card to come and clean their car. I can go on all of the different things I've been mistaken for when I'm outside my home. I think it's important that we understand what the experiences are for Black people in our community. And I'm glad Dara brought up the education system. We didn't get to talk about it much today. But right now, 33% of all suspensions in the TDSP are Black children, and we only have a 78% chance of graduating. I'm a taxpayer. I need to know that my child is going to graduate from high school in this city, and we have to guarantee that our schools report and give us that information on how well they're doing or not doing with our Black children. All of our politicians that are on the line, you all have Black strategies that you're implementing. There's a national strategy. Rima, I know the Black Caucus is doing its best to hold on to what's left of the provincial Black strategy. And we also have the city anti-Black racism strategy. We also have to hold them accountable to making sure that all of the tenets in those strategies are implemented, and to continue having these conversations. And I really want to thank DECA for pushing forward with this, and Lanrick for being a stellar resident in ensuring that issues of Black people in our communities are brought front and center.
Thank you. Cheryl, I'm going to give you the last word.
I was ready to applaud you for being amazing for the community. Great statements, Letitia. Secondly, how fantastic Lanrick is. I met him at an event years ago, and I'm so grateful to still be in contact with him. You guys have a wonderful person in your community. So I guess my words would be, yeah, like this is a really great conversation. I really appreciate how everyone has been so candid in providing their thoughts on these topics, and Dara, again, you know, bringing to light just the experience of being Black, and these little small, they seem small, but they add up, right? Yeah. We talk about them as being like microaggressions. It's like just small, tiny doses of racism. And again, when I say racism, it's not something that you do because you hate someone. It's something that we've all been socialized to do, right? Even within Black people, there are oftentimes anti-Black racism within ourselves because the society that we live in teaches us to devalue Black people. Like, anti-Black racism is so bad that we are in the decade for people of African descent. This is declared by the United Nations. We're in a decade for people of African descent. It took Canada 3 years to acknowledge the decade. So we got 3 years late to the decade. And this is the fact that we're in this decade is something that most of us don't even know about. Again, that is just one of the examples of how anti-Black racism is so entrenched within society. And just by having these conversations, we can bring them to light and to allow ourselves to be more accountable in leading towards a future where, you know, Black people are able to have, you know, access to affordable housing and resources for healthy living, and to, you know, thrive and to just share in this wonderful planet that we've been blessed with and that we should be taking care of. So, yeah.
Allison, DECA, again, thank you very much for this time. Thank you, everyone, the audience. We're going to do more of these. We're going to do more of these.
Well done.
Yay. Thank you so much, Nicole.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Bye.